Hey everyone, welcome to this midway point of session. And I want to talk today about keeping our practice alive and fresh and vital. As we know, practice takes a long time. And inevitably, if we're not paying close attention, it can lose energy, go kind of flat. And that goes even for during session. Especially maybe around this point. So this is a good point to revitalize our energy and recommit to the rest of the time, precious time we have together that is so rare to be able to have an entire week to devote ourselves entirely just to practice. I wonder, a lot of you have done many sessions before, and I wonder if you know this phenomenon of we can find ourselves running the same old stale patterns, especially maybe on a warm, sleepy afternoon, and we just can so easily get into these ruts in our mind. I'm sure we all know the conditioned tracks we can all start to run in, or sometimes we can just seem to lose energy altogether and we're just kind of coasting along. So I really want to talk about ways of renewing, refreshing, reinvigorating our practice, and taking hold of it and really making it our own. One thing that I find in general about practitioners is it's really common for us to get too passive. And in other words, to wait to be told what to do next or how to do it. And my experience is actually quite the opposite. When I was traveling around doing my book, One Bird, One Stone, I talked to about 100 teachers and senior practitioners. And to my surprise, I found they varied a lot more than I expected in everybody's doing it for the right reasons. Everybody's invested and cares about practice, but some people seem to be more awake in the practice is all I can say. Some people seem to have really grown deeply, deeply in practice more than others. And it's something I've wondered about a lot, what really makes practice spark for some people and other people. Well, every once in a while you run into that person you think they've been practicing for 20 years, you know? But then again, whenever I say anything like that to Shishin Roshi, he says, well, you should have seen them before they started practicing, you know? So we all transform through practice, but how can we really actualize that in a deeper way? So I want to share some ideas and personal ways that I work with this. Part of it is to find new angles and new ways of looking at practice and of seeing our practice to re-inspire ourselves. Sometimes, of course, we go back to our ancestors who made amazing discoveries, but also there's new research, new discoveries being made in physics, for instance, about the nature of reality, in brain science about the nature of the brain and the mind, in psychology, the things that some of it was anticipated incredibly. For instance, Dogen, a long time before Einstein, wrote one of the fascicles in Shobogenzo about how time is relative, and many other things like that. But one of the things I admire is even our senior people and teachers make new discoveries all the time. We saw that with Mui's talk yesterday, new directions, new angles on how to think about and talk about practice. But also Shishin Roshi he and I both recently looked at a book by a neuroscientist who's also a Tibetan and Theravadan teacher. His name's John Yates, and the book's called The Illuminated Mind. And he went back to the Vishuddhamagga, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, one of the Sri Lankan traditional Theravadan texts. And it's pretty impenetrable to the contemporary reader, but he went back and really dug into that and then compared it with what he knew of brain science, and made some really interesting reinterpretations and discoveries that are quite accessible. One of the things was that the one-pointed focus part of the mind can coexist at the same time as the broader part of the mind, which can, for instance, we can be focused on mu or something, but the broader part of the mind can kind of be watching for the next thought distraction that's about to arise and get in the way. And in fact, Shishin Roshi brought in that particular aspect and gave a talk about it a while back. So just being willing to bring in, to refresh our minds with new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking. And also, what was interesting about that book for me was this John Yates was not a Zen practitioner. He's a Tibetan and Theravadan practitioner and teacher. One of the most important moments in my practice, in 35 years of practice, was actually Shishin Roshi quoting David Hume, the 17th century Scottish philosopher, in a Dharma talk. And I'd heard many times about that there's no subject and object that's dealt with, there's no separate subject and object that's dealt with in Dharma all the time. And old ancient teachers talk about it, contemporary teachers talk about it, but Shishin Roshi went to David Hume, a philosopher who probably had never encountered Buddhism, and quoted him as saying that if we look closely at perception, then we can't find a separate subject and object. What we find is there's a continuum, there's just perception. It's as though we have two ends of the same stick, and we call one end the subject, the other end the object. But if you look closely, there's just the stick, there's just perception. There's no clear dividing line between the subject and object. That was a completely fresh and different angle on something I'd heard many times. And it really opened up practice for me in a really big way, instantly in that session, because I started looking around and realized, oh, he's right. Of course, you can't find a clear distinction between observer and the thing observed. But this is something I want to point out too. We all know that we have to sit, and we all know that we have to hear teachings. What we often don't, where I see students not engaging, is contemplating, checking out, testing the teachings, trying to see for ourselves. Sometimes we can just be too passive, as though if we hear the teachings and then we just go sit, it's just going to happen. But for me in that moment, it was Roshi quoting David Hume, and then it was me going, is that really so? And then looking around, and sure enough it was. But sure enough I saw that it was. But you see, it was, of course, it's also the bond with the teacher, which Mui spoke very movingly about yesterday. That he just trusts Shishin Roshi, and so his words went right into me. But even though I trust him, I had to go, wait a minute, really? And take a look for myself. So we have to remember that part of it. We have to remember that when we hear something, and especially something that piques our interest, we need to look into it for ourselves. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along. But Zen, of course, is the study of the self, as Dogen tells us, and of our mind, of the mind, the way the mind works. And and I really saw this fresh approach in Mui's talk yesterday. Of course, he's a psychotherapist, so he automatically brings in psychotherapy. Um, he brought in Star Wars. That's a contemporary way of looking at things. But also, he looked into brain science, which was interesting. And I was really struck by the way he compared the neural pathways, the brain neural pathways, to Google Maps. And it's actually a great metaphor for the conditioned routes we travel and reinforce again and again. And although I was a little worried about his report of driving under the influence of samadhi, I think that, that might be a new thing that the police department needs to look at as mindfulness and meditation gets more broad throughout the culture. But there are thoroughfares, the big thoroughfares. These are stories we travel over and over and over again, and these are the ruts we often get caught in. And but practice is about choosing different routes and overcoming our conditioning so that we see in fresh and new ways. So to extend Mui's metaphor, I guess we could speak of Zen as a kind of spiritual GPS, showing us new routes. There's all sorts of great new ideas in Mui's talk yesterday. For instance, I was very struck by his mention of Star Wars underwear. I think we should institute that for all monastics, that should just be part of the uniform. Actually, for all I know, it is part of his uniform. We wouldn't know, would we? But also, and it was interesting the way he balanced the kind of a new metaphor off of the traditional story of Huineng. So going back to the ancestors, and it strikes me that there's stuff back there that's been somewhat left behind too, like contests. I mean, talk about refreshing our practice. There's an idea there. We could be holding contests. And isn't it funny how different they did things back then? And it wasn't just the contests, but also Huineng has to flee the monastery because his poem is chosen over the head monk's poem, and the head monk is jealous, and Huineng has to flee for his life. Apparently, all I can say is they sure took their poetry seriously, But yeah, so there's some things we shouldn't import from the past, but I'm glad we don't do things with that degree of competitiveness. Although I'm getting a little nervous about the way Mui's looking at me lately. I'm starting to think like maybe he's after me, But one of the things I was struck by Mui's description of samadhi and how samadhi is for him. And I realized, as I often have in talking closely to people about practice, that the way he enters it, experiences it, and works with it is different from the way I do. And the thing about Zen practice is it can seem so structured that we can forget there's infinite freedom in the form. I mean, after all, a lot of the time you're just sitting there. Nobody knows what you're doing, right? So some of the things that he shared, for instance, our instruction is, in general, to sit with our eyes open. What did he say about entering samadhi? It's easier to enter with his eyes closed. Mui's breaking that rule. Well, with good reason, right? Because he discovered something for himself. And then the thing about eyes opening when he really kind of locked into samadhi. That's not something I've ever heard before. So, at a certain point, a mark of maturity in practice is we find our own way with these things. It's also when I talk to people about how they work with koans, it's different for different people. So one of the things that wakes our practice up is to find new angles, new ways of looking at it, new dimensions, but also, of course, we honor what our teachers tell us, but this is a do-it-yourself practice. This is why I came to Zen. It's because we're supposed to check out everything that we're told in our own practice. And I really encourage everybody to do that, and to not, I guess we're all going to fool ourselves sometimes, and we're all going to coast sometimes. I've certainly done that in the past in sessions. I've got to say, I work pretty hard in session now. I just learned there's no point in wasting my time. But I certainly, in the old days, there were plenty of afternoons I just kind of coasted along in a half dreamy state, kind of spacing out. And really, the way I look at it now is what a waste of time that was. And why didn't I question that I was doing it, you know? Why didn't I even kind of half notice that I was doing it? I think that happens to a lot of us. I know it happens to a lot of us because, of course, I talk to you all, and I talk to many other students as well. So I encourage everybody. Sometimes it's just like we feel like, oh, I'm tired, I want to rest. But usually backing off and spacing out just makes us more tired. What the magic of zazen is, if we re-engage it and we kind of re-up our ante, that the energy will come, renewed energy will come. We'll find a second wind, kind of. So I encourage us to just try and be aware of what we're doing, and try and raise the oomph to overcome those tendencies to fall into the same ruts. And we all like to fool ourselves. Everybody does it. So, but you know, it's so transformative when we catch ourselves doing it, right? I remember one time, some years into my practice, and I would do periods of monastic residence. At that point, early in my practice, it was at Zen Mountain Monastery in New York, and but there were times I didn't go there for a year, and there'd be times I'd spend a lot of months there in a year. But during one of those periods at I was doing my home practice, and one day I just realized I'm sitting down here like I always do, but I'm not practicing. I'm just sitting here thinking. And I thought, how long have I been doing this? And I kind of looked back over my practice. I realized I've been doing that for at least months, maybe even a year. I just completely had somehow forgotten that when you sit down, you meditate. I thought if I was sitting down, I was doing it, right? And actually, I realized all I was doing, I wasn't even trying. But, you know, I was so unconscious of that for quite a period of time. And then it just clicked for me. Oh, wait a minute. What am I doing? So this thing about contemplating and checking out the teachings against our own experience, you know, maybe it's not clarified that much. I think some of us just get that that's what it's about. Of course, we're supposed to contemplate and check it out and ponder it. Of course, we're not pondering with the thinking mind while we're on our cushion. We're not getting caught in that kind of mental cogitation. But if you've ever read Dogen, one of the things he says again and again when he raises a principle, to oftentimes in speaking to his monks, he says, you should deeply examine this. And so what's he telling them to do? He's telling them to go away, check it out against their own practice, also think about it when they're not sitting on the cushion. Because that's a way you can fool yourself too. You're sitting there philosophizing, which won't get us very far. But where it can get us is, for instance, that moment with David Hume. There's a moment of thought there, and Roshi communicated in words, right? But then once I checked it out and I saw that it was so, there was no more thinking. They were just wandering around going, oh, wow, yeah, that's the way it is, you know? So, so that's the way it works. But, you know, when you hear about something like, well, just like I asked about David Hume, one of the most common things I asked myself internally is that really so? You know, is that really? And some of the koans are about that. Some of the koans raise a point of doctrine that in in their era would have been virtually unquestioned. For instance, there was one I looked at with one of you recently about it was all about karma and how what we suffer today is retribution for karma and all that. And the koans are just full of points like that that are being raised specifically for the practitioner to cut through the doctrine, because we're supposed to think for ourselves. We're supposed to see for ourselves. And points like that would have been unquestioned at various times in history. So the koans are actually trying to stimulate that attitude of inquiry. The koans are really good for that. However, I've done probably more years of shikantaza than koan study. I'm a very natural shikantaza practitioner. But if you're doing shikantaza, they're especially just sitting practice, especially that's where it can get too passive. And we need to raise that spirit of inquiry. It's like, if we're on a cross-country train ride and we're sitting there, just sitting in the train, but are you going to look out the window and check out the scenery, or are you going to be looking at your phone? That's a bit what shikantaza is like. We sit shikantaza, and in a sense we're non-doing, but we're very interested in the scenery. We're very interested in what we're seeing. We have to keep that spirit of inquiry alive, because that's like what stirs the pot. Koan practice can get too driven. We can just be driving, pushing. Shikantaza can get too passive. Working with the breath can get too mechanical. There's pitfalls and possibilities in all these practices. So I'm just saying we have to watch and be discerning and not let ourselves fall into practicing by rote, not really paying attention to what we're doing. So sometimes that kind of contemplation can take us to the edge of practice. For instance, I'm experiencing something in my zazen that thought might occur, oh, is this what they're talking about when they talk about emptiness? Well, let's check it out. That to have that thought raise and point us further into practice is not a problem. It's only a problem if you start thinking, well, emptiness out of which everything comes. Who first spoke about emptiness? Well, I think that was basically a Mahayana thing. We find that in the Mahayana sutras, right? Then we're off to the races, right? It's more like, oh, this is what they're talking about. That's probably where that contemplation side, it's about the only place it usually functions within my sitting practice. But it functions that way a lot. What's the nature of perception? Is there any, when they talk about illusion, when the old teachers talk about illusion and that we don't see things as they truly are, what do they mean? What's the nature of that illusion? There's also old points of practice that we can discover if we come to them with a fresh mind. One recently for me has been working with the hara. Actually, the whole process that led me to working in a different way with the hara came from me checking out Qigong, which is, of course, Taoism. And when Buddhism met Taoism in China, it became Zen. So Zen's got a healthy admixture of Taoism. And in fact, near as I can tell, and I've looked pretty extensively, the hara practice, I believe, came from Taoism. That they deal with the Dantian, the center of gravity point in the body. It's a basic thing in Taoism. And when Buddhist monastics and practitioners first came to China, the Taoists and Buddhists felt that their practices were so close that they were so much about the same sort of thing, that they would practice in the same monasteries. But, uh, but so we picked up that hara practice and centering the breath in the belly. Those of you who know me know that I'm always um, working with physical practices because I've got a chronic fatigue, pretty debilitating at times, chronic fatigue issue, and I have had for 35 years. So I'm always looking for new ways to keep the body strong and to raise energy, and looking into this qigong system. Actually, let me talk you all into this. This is a little unconventional, but I'd always practiced with the hara a lot. But to me, the hara is this big area below the navel, right? Kind of somewhere in there, about three fingers below the navel in the center of the body, and that worked pretty well. But this qigong system I've been studying, let me just show you this. It'll only take a minute. If you take your three fingers like this, and you place them just below your navel vertically, and press each fingertip in, and one of those fingertip spots will be a little more sensitive than the others. And that's a certain particular acupuncture point. So this is the way they find the exact dantian, which in this system they say is only about the size of a pea. And so you travel back horizontally from that point that you just found to about the center of the body. Then that line intersects with the center of your perineum, which is that area of the lowest abdomen that you would tighten up if you were trying not to urinate while giving a talk or sitting in zazen or anywhere else, right? So if you kind of tighten up that muscle and you imagine a line going up from the middle of that and meeting the other line, you get like a little crosshairs. That's where they say that's how precisely we should center the attention if you really want to be on the exact point of the hara or dantian. And I found that it makes a difference. It's if we really put our mind in there and kind of try and feel that point, there's a slight feeling like pulling or magnetic feeling, or some people feel it as heat. And the mind just kind of wants to go there. And it strengthens that sense of concentration and energy and groundedness, all the stuff that we know from practicing with the hara. To make it even more, this is hara, this is being a hara nerd, okay? To make it even more nerdy, then they advocate that you should move the mind up about a quarter inch, down a quarter inch, to one side a quarter inch, to the other side a quarter inch, to each side a quarter inch, until just to check out that you're really on that point. So when I first heard that, I thought, move the mind a quarter inch. Okay, it's pretty precise. But anyway, it's a strong practice, and I've been using it when I work with the hara and zazen, and that's where it came from, Taoism anyway. So why not go back to that source and see if we can get a little more precise about that practice. There's also rinzai practices that we haven't been imported into our system that also have really precise work with the hara. And so anyway, it's added something to my practice. It's refreshed. I mean, I thought I knew the hara. So there's one other place I want to go with this, and this also has to do with finding new directions or new ways of looking at practice. Now, I mentioned a book before. I'm going to mention a book now. This doesn't mean you go look the book up on your phone in the middle of session, right? It means this is to perhaps awaken some new points of view, and then afterwards, we look it up. So I've recently been reading this book, and it's one of the best Dharma books I've read in a long time. My Stroke of Insight, and she never mentions the Dharma. I think she mentions, she brushes past it twice. Jill Bolte Taylor was a neuroscientist who suffered who suffered a massive stroke when she was 37, and it wiped out her left hemisphere for a time, which catapulted her into a state of oneness and bliss, because her previously dominant analytical language, linear functions of her left brain were turned off. And since she was a neuroscientist, she was fascinated and studied the process from the inside, and then worked really hard to regain her left brain function, and but not lose the bliss. So it's a really interesting angle on what is the self, what are we practicing with in letting go of thought, in working with the way our minds work. This book was written, I think, in 2010. Brain science has advanced a little since then, so it's not quite as simple as left brain and right brain. It's now known, but nonetheless, it's a perfect lens through which to look at certain amounts of experience. I just want to read you a couple things to kind of show you how a different angle on the same material we look at can be eye-opening. And she, as far as I know, she knew nothing about Eastern philosophy. She had no interest in any of this stuff. She was just catapulted into this state of oneness and of no self. And she talks about it from a pretty scientific point of view, which I find really refreshing and clarifying, and there's no doctrine in it because that's not where she's coming from, right? So this is one of the things she discovered as she lost her left hemisphere of her brain and tried to get it back. One of the jobs of our left hemisphere language centers is to define ourself by saying I am. Through the use of brain chatter, your brain repeats over and over again the details of your life so you can remember them. It is the home of your ego center, which provides you with an internal awareness of what your name is, what your credentials are, and where you live. Without these cells performing their job, you would forget who you are and lose track of your life and your identity. Sound familiar? Okay, and later on she says this: without my language center telling me I am Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, I am a neuroanatomist, I live at this address and can be reached at this phone number. Without that, I felt no obligation to be her anymore. I find this so amusing. It's such a you know, because it's all new to her. She's so innocent in it as she experiences it. It was a truly bizarre shift in perception, but without Jill Bolte Taylor's emotional circuitry reminding me of her likes and dislikes, or her ego center reminding me about her patterns of critical judgment, I didn't think like her anymore. From a practical perspective, being her again wasn't even an option in my mind. From my new perspective, that Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor died that morning and no longer existed. Now that I didn't know her life, her relationships, successes, and mistakes, I was no longer bound to her decisions or her self-induced limitations. Isn't that interesting? This is something that was just obvious to her because of the way things unfolded. So this leads me back to a way of refreshing our practice, and part of what I'm saying, of course, is to be willing to be creative about your practice. You want a really interesting way to look at your mind the next time you're beset by thoughts, your thinking mind. See if you can catch and notice how many thoughts are about yourself. It'll be almost all of them. And sometimes when we bring something like that up to awareness, we might reflect, again, this is the contemplation part, we might reflect, wait a minute, practice isn't about the self. Practice is to forget the self. Why am I entertaining these thoughts? Why am I letting them run? This is me reinforcing the self, right? And sometimes we can use an insight like that as a kind of leverage to wake ourselves out of the trance of whatever problem we're mulling over again and again, and just go, wait a minute, I can let this stuff go. I practiced letting go of thoughts for a million years. I can do this. Um, and sometimes it's like a spatula sliding under the veggie burger of the ego and flipping it over, and then we're free of it, right? Sometimes that can happen. In fact, that's happened sometimes. Getting a bit of leverage over a kind of thought like that has proven to be not only a great practice in the moment, but sometimes that's worked. That sort of thing has worked for me for months and months and months after. And then what happens is that wears out because the brain likes novelty, and so then we have to discover something else, you know. But that's all part of the kind of engagement with our practice that I'm advocating. That kind of active, creative engagement with our practice. It's our practice. That's what it's supposed to be. Just got a few minutes left, but I want to just share a little bit more, because one of the things that happened is, okay, so this woman is catapulted into, I think she only mentions twice something that could be like connected to Buddhism. There's one point when she's in this kind of amazing state of oneness. She loses all sense of any boundary, of any edge. She can't even see edges as edges, because that's, as it turns out, is a left brain function. She can't tell what an edge is. Somebody tries to point out the edges of things to her, and she doesn't know what they're talking about. Everything's joined. She sees everything as joined, including herself, her own body. Yeah, kind of amazing. But as she recognizes that she has to fight to regain her left brain function, and it takes her 8 years to do that. And the perspective she gains while regaining that and not wanting to lose what she's discovered, that's kind of amazing too. There's a TED talk called the same title as the book, My Stroke of Insight. Don't look it up during session. Look it up after session. It's only 20 minutes long, and she kind of encapsulates her whole journey. And the TED Talk itself is kind of an amazing glimpse into what all this is about. Let's see. Here we go. So this is as she's starting to work very hard to regain her left brain function. And what we're talking about here is, we don't usually phrase it this way in Zen, but there is a category of mindfulness in Theravada Buddhism called mindfulness of mind. This is what we're talking about, looking directly at the mind. The Theravadan is somewhat different from this perspective. One of the things I've done with my Sage Institute program, where I train meditation leaders, is one of the common confusions in our practice is we use this term ego, which is a term that is 100 or 150 years old. It's not the term the Buddha used. We talk about a certain aspect of the personality as ego. The Buddha didn't say no ego, he said no self. So one of the things that I've been doing is trying to define for the people I train, well, what is this ego thing? What do we actually work with? Do we, Joe Bolte Taylor has a sense of self. It's just not a problematic one, you know? So one way to look at it is you could speak of the ego as all the defense systems we have around our self-image. And we actually, in the Sage Institute training, we work with a list of these, and they include things like resistance, defensiveness, judgment, embarrassment, self-consciousness, taking things personally, taking offense, excessive pride. Anyway, that's a pretty good smattering of defenses that are largely not 100% ego-based. Some of them, sometimes we need to resist, and that's not always ego. But the interesting thing is she starts to talk about all the factors that dropped out of her life when her left brain was turned off. They're all exactly those factors. The list is almost identical. It's kind of uncanny, you know? So, um, and here's one of the other big aspects that we look at is uh, some of you have heard me in the past give a talk on the 5 conditions, which is a version that Bernie Glassman started and I adapted of the 5 skandhas or 5 aggregates. Um, if anyone's interested in follow up with me after session. And there's an article I wrote about it in Tricycle Magazine that kind of lays out the whole way we work with it. But just for shorthand, I think we all know that there's direct experience of reality, or at least as close as we get to reality, and then there's all the stories and projections we overlay on it, right? So the 5 conditions was a particular way of looking at that. But here's her way of looking at it. Just what she realizes just because she sees it clearly. One of the most prominent characteristics of our left brain is its ability to weave stories. This storyteller portion of our mind's language center is specifically designed to make sense of the world outside of us. I might quibble with outside of us, but anyway, based upon minimal amounts of information. It functions by taking whatever details it has and then weaves them together. Most impressively, our left brain is brilliant in its ability to make stuff up and fill in the blanks when there are gaps in the facts. Anybody recognize this? Anybody, does this sound familiar? Anyone get any deja vu or anything? It's particularly effective at hooking into circuits of emotion and exhausting all the what if possibilities. Anybody ever done that on the cushion? Oh, if only. Oh, what if I'd done this instead of that, right? As my left brain language centers recovered and became functional again, I spent a lot of time noticing how my storyteller would draw conclusions based on minimal information. For the longest time, I found the antics of my storyteller to be rather comical, at least until I realized that my left mind full-heartedly expected the rest of my brain to believe the stories it was making up. I need to remember that there are enormous gaps between what I know and what I think I know. Oh, anybody getting a buzz of familiarity from those words, not knowing, beginner's mind, and all of that. I learned that I need to be very wary of my storyteller's potential for stirring up drama and trauma. I especially notice it has a tendency to be redundant, manifesting loops of thought patterns that reverberate through my mind over and over again. The portion of my left mind that I chose not to recover in her 8 years of recovering her left mind was the part of my left hemisphere character that had the potential to be mean, worry incessantly, or be verbally abusive to myself or others. During the process of recovery, I found the portion of my character that was stubborn, arrogant, and or jealous resided in the ego center of my left brain. Anyway, she lived with this outside perspective on the left brain so often that for so long that she developed her own ways of working with it and noticing when this came up again and being able to disengage from it. And I think we've all heard that emotion left to its own devices will pass quickly if we don't grab onto it, right? Or lock onto it with a story. She claims, I don't know that I can independently verify this exactly, but she claims that a raw emotion, if we don't grasp it, reject it, or add a story to it, will only last 90 seconds. So she says she learned all she has to do when she feels angry or upset or irritated or whatever is wait 90 seconds, not engage, not push it away either. She's fully aware of it, be aware of it, and then it'll pass. Now, I don't know if I get irritated if it passes in 90 seconds, but it'll certainly pass in 5 minutes if I don't latch onto it or in some way engage with it. So anyway, I bring all that up just to say that when we hear that we're enlightened already and we just need to discover it, she kind of discovered that. She kind of discovered it. It's all it, for most of us, especially in this culture, that whether you divvy it up to left or right brain exactly or whatever, uh, mostly those functions of our mind, which are largely rooted in the left brain, have become dominant, and they squash out the voice of the right brain. Again, oversimplification, but they squash out the capacity that we all have to feel that kind of unity and joy and present moment immersion in experience without living in worry and fear. Because the striking thing she was in a life-threatening, if she hadn't got immediate care, she would have died. And in prior centuries, it wouldn't have mattered the care, she would have died. So here she is in a life or death situation. She's completely unworried. She's one with the universe. No problem, And that was just in her. All it took was just having to have the other part of the brain that had always dominated turned off. So again, I don't know that it's all in the brain. She's a neuroanatomist, so she interprets it that way. Scientists before and since have looked for consciousness in the brain and haven't been able to find it. But whether the brain's a conduit for consciousness or whether it's actually manufactured there doesn't really matter in this context. It's when the analytic part of her brain was turned off, it was all right there for her. And this is something we experience from time to time in practice. I bring this up because I've worked very consciously with those kind of mind loops and those kind of thought patterns that are just not serving. And she goes on later to say that she continues to work with them every day, and sometimes she has to work with certain sticky patterns 1,000 times a day. And I've had to do the same thing. But most people will give up, but it's worth the effort. It's worth the effort. Negative self-talk was a big one for me. That took me about 1.5 years of concerted effort to finally root out the daily continual practice looking at those negative voices that weren't true. I'm not saying I turned off all self-discernment. We need self-discernment, but I think the voice. I think the voices I mean, the ones that say we won't succeed, we're not good enough, we're whatever. We all know our version of them. We don't have to live with those voices. We can, and not only that, but this isn't just psychological practice, because what blocks us from seeing unity is often that kind of I'm not good enough voice. I'm not good enough to see unity. I'm not good enough to experience enlightenment or realization or an opening. I'm not good enough to be as cool as the Roshis. That's the kind of stuff that, when it's simply removed, can hugely liberate our natural ability to just see who we really are, at bottom. So I encourage everybody to re-up, reignite, re-inspire, and dive back in. And I'll be diving back in with you, and I've been enjoying talking with you all in the afternoons. So please come see me, and we can talk a little bit more about this and about your practice. Thank you all.